Hello, and welcome back to another evening together. Tonight we're doing something I've been wanting to do for a while, and I think it's going to make for a genuinely cozy few hours. We're going to talk about Dexter. Specifically, we're going to talk about all the people across the entire franchise. All 8 original seasons, New Blood, the flashbacks, the prequels, the whole lot. Who looked at Dexter Morgan and thought, something is wrong with this person. Because there were quite a few of them. More than you might remember, actually, when you sit down and list them all out. And what I find so interesting about that list, the reason I keep coming back to it, is how different each of those stories are. Some of these people got close by following evidence. Some got close purely by instinct. Some knew the whole truth and chose to say nothing. Some took the secret to their graves. And a few of them, just a few, actually had him. The thing about Dexter as a show is that it's structured around dramatic irony. You know, from episode 1, you know exactly what Dexter Morgan is. And so every interaction he has with the people around him carries this extra weight, because you're watching people who don't know what you know, and you're waiting to see how close they get. It's part of what makes the show so rewatchable. You go back and you catch the little moments. The look Dokes gives him across the bullpen. The way Lagerta's eyes narrowed during an interrogation. The way Deborah looks at him differently after she learns the truth, and you realize, watching it back, that she was looking at him a little differently even before. It's all there if you know where to look. So tonight, that's what we're doing. We're going through every major character who suspected Dexter, who got close to figuring him out, who actually did figure him out, or who spent significant screen time chasing something they could feel but couldn't quite name. We'll go roughly in the order they came along, which means we'll be moving through the seasons as we go. It's a nice way to revisit the whole series without it feeling like a recap. More like a guided walk through the parts of the show that are specifically about Dexter being seen, or almost seen, or seen completely with disastrous consequences. And I'll be honest, I find something genuinely fascinating about this corner of the show. Because what Dexter presents is this scenario where a man is surrounded constantly by trained investigators. People whose entire professional lives are dedicated to reading other people, identifying deception, building cases out of nothing. And he fools most of them. Not all of them, but most of them. And the ones he doesn't fool, the show does something really interesting with almost every single one. It's also worth saying, "Anazafo abene," and this is part of why this topic works well as sleep content specifically, that the suspicion arcs all have this comfortable shape to them when you already know the outcome. There's no anxiety in watching Dokes follow Dexter through season 2 when you've already seen how it ends. There's no dread in watching Lagerta build her case. You know the shape of it. You know where the edges are. Which means you can just sit with the detail, the texture, the specific way each of these characters move through their investigation and what it says about who they were. That's a different experience from the first watch. Easier, quieter, good for a long evening. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It does genuinely help, and I put out these long-form Dexter companion pieces fairly regularly at this point, so there's plenty more where this came from. But for now, get yourself settled. Get comfortable, and let's start at the very beginning, which in Dexter's case means starting with a cop called Harry Morgan and a little boy who was already making people uneasy long before he had any idea what he was. One thing I want to say before we dive in, and this is something I genuinely believe rather than just a throat-clearing disclaimer. Dexter is a show that rewards rewatching in a very specific way. Most shows that rely on dramatic irony, where the audience knows something the characters don't, tend to feel a bit hollow on a second watch because the tension that drove the first viewing has been resolved. Dexter is different, because what the rewatching reveals is not just how obvious the clues were, but how consistently good the people around Dexter were at their jobs. It's not that everyone in Miami Metro is incompetent. Some of them are quite good. It's that Dexter is extraordinarily good at what he does on both levels, the forensics and the deception. And the show is honest about that. The suspicion arcs are, for me, the heart of what makes Dexter work as long-form television. Each person who suspects him brings a different lens. Each investigation follows a different methodology. Each near miss happens for a different reason, and the reasons are almost always interesting. This isn't a show where the protagonist survives because everyone around him is stupid. It's a show where he survives because he's exceptionally skilled at reading people, managing information, and identifying threats early enough to neutralize them. The fact that several people still get very close despite all of that is, if anything, a testament to the quality of the people trying to catch him. So we're going to go through all of them, in order, slowly. There's no rush. We've got hours ahead of us and nowhere to be, and the Miami nights are warm, and Dexter's boat is out on the water somewhere, and the dark passenger is someone else's problem for the evening. Just hours to observe from a comfortable distance. A brief note on scope: we're covering the original 8 seasons Dexter, New Blood, and touching on the connections to the franchise's expanded material where it's relevant. We're not going deep into Original Sin tonight. That's a separate conversation for another time. But a few of those connections will surface naturally as we go. If you haven't seen New Blood yet and you're worried about spoilers, fair warning that we're going to cover the full arc through to the end of that series. Everything is fair game. Right, let's begin. Let me back up, because to understand the whole Suspicion story, you need to understand how it started. And how it started is with Harry. Harry Morgan is Dexter's adoptive father, a Miami homicide detective, a man who, by most accounts, was good at his job, cared genuinely about the city he worked in, and had a particular talent for seeing things clearly, even when they were uncomfortable. Which is relevant because what Harry saw in young Dexter was deeply uncomfortable, and what he chose to do about it is the entire reason there's a show to watch at all. Dexter was 3 years old when Harry found him, sitting in a shipping container in a pool of blood. His mother, Laura Moser, had been murdered in front of him. His biological brother Brian was there too. Harry took Dexter home, raised him as his own, and for a while, probably for a few years if we're being generous, things seemed like they might be fine. Kids who witness trauma can recover. People do. It happens. Except Dexter didn't exactly recover in the conventional sense. He went somewhere else with it. The early signs were the animals. Neighborhood pets going missing, a grave behind the house that Harry found one day. And it wasn't just Buddy the dog inside it. There were others. Harry took Dexter to a crime scene, something he presumably regretted immediately, and watched his young son study the body, not with horror, but with this quiet, absorbed fascination, like he was cataloging it. Harry brought him home that evening and called Dr. Evelyn Vogel. Vogel is someone we'll come back to properly later, but for now, what matters is that she was a neuropsychiatrist who specialized in psychopathy, and Harry went to her because he needed someone to tell him he was wrong about his son. She didn't tell him that. What she told him instead was that he was right, that Dexter showed every diagnostic marker she'd expect to see, and that the urges he was already displaying weren't going to go away. They were going to grow. The question wasn't whether Dexter would eventually kill someone. It was what and who and whether that could be shaped, and that's where the code comes from. It's a strange thing to sit with, honestly. Harry and Vogel essentially decided together that the answer to raising a child who would inevitably become a killer was to teach him to be a very specific kind of killer, to give the darkness a structure, a set of rules, only targets who have themselves taken lives and escaped justice. Do the research, be absolutely certain, never leave evidence, never kill innocents. The Code of Harry, which sounds like the title of a very niche lifestyle podcast, but is in practice a fairly elaborate moral framework for a serial killer, which is a sentence I never expected to type, but here we are. Harry's suspicion, unlike everyone else on this list, wasn't a suspicion at all. It was a certainty he arrived at early, confirmed by a professional, and then spent years trying to manage. The flashbacks we get across the series, many of them Harry's therapy sessions with Vogel, recorded on DVD, show a man who was genuinely tormented by what he was doing. He loved Dexter. He also knew what Dexter was. And he believed, or talked himself into believing, that the code was the most humane option available. What's interesting is that Harry never told Deborah, not once in all the years he was alive. He kept the whole thing from his daughter, who grew up in the same house, who loved Dexter as a brother, who became a cop herself, partly, you suspect, because of her father's influence. Harry decided to protect Deborah from the truth completely. We find out later that this had a cost. Deborah's eventual discovery of who Dexter really was hit her so hard, partly because she'd been kept in the dark her whole life by the person she trusted most. The other piece of Harry's story that I think is worth sitting with is how it ended. Because Harry didn't die peacefully, comfortable in the knowledge that his plan was working. He died of a heart attack, yes, but the flashbacks tell us something more complicated. At some point, after Dexter began killing under the code, Harry caught him in the aftermath, came home, or arrived somewhere to find the full reality of what he'd trained his son to do. The plastic sheeting, the blood, the meticulous dismemberment, the thing he'd known intellectually suddenly made physical. And Harry couldn't live with it. He died believing he had created a monster. Vogel tells Dexter this in season 8, and it lands hard because Harry had spent so long telling himself he was saving Dexter, helping him, giving him a framework for a livable life. And in the end, he looked at the result and folded. There's no neat conclusion to Harry's arc. He was the first person to truly see Dexter and the first person to decide that the seeing came with a responsibility to act. Whether he acted rightly is a question the show deliberately refuses to answer cleanly. Dexter himself isn't sure, neither at various points is Vogel. And Deborah, when she finally learns all of it, goes through a grief that isn't just about Dexter. It's about her father too, and what he kept from her, and what it cost him. But it starts with Harry. It always starts with Harry, and I think what's worth sitting with, as we move through everyone else on this list, is how Harry's choice set the terms for everything that followed. By deciding to contain rather than expose, to redirect rather than stop, Harry essentially established the conditions under which every future suspicion would play out. Dexter didn't end up at Miami Metro by accident. Harry arranged it. Harry trained him to think like a forensic investigator because Harry understood that the best way to hide in a homicide department is to understand exactly how homicides get investigated. He gave Dexter the tools to evade the very institution he worked within. That's not nothing. It's an extraordinary act of either love or hubris, depending on how you look at it, and I've never quite made up my mind which it is. Probably both. Harry loved Dexter deeply and genuinely. The flashbacks make that clear, the warmth of those scenes, the way James Remar plays Harry as a man caught between what he knows and what he feels. And he was also, perhaps, making a decision that no single person should make about something that affects so many others. One detail about Harry that I keep returning to, he was good police, not just adequate, genuinely good. The flashbacks show a man who knew his city, who cared about the victims he worked for, who had a particular skill for finding people others had given up looking for. The fact that he looked at his son's nature and arrived at the code, rather than denial or exposure, is partly a product of that investigative intelligence. He was good at building systems, good at thinking about how outcomes could be managed. The code is, in a strange way, a piece of police work, a framework for managing a threat that the conventional system couldn't handle. The irony that Harry the detective essentially designed the perfect way to evade detection for his detective son is one of the show's quieter jokes. Everything Dexter knows about forensic procedure, about how investigators think, about what evidence leaves traces and what can be made to disappear. Harry gave him all of it. The man who would have investigated the Bay Harbor Butcher most effectively if he'd lived long enough is the man who trained the Bay Harbor Butcher how not to be caught. The other thing about Harry that I find interesting, and that the show returns to several times through Dexter's visions of him, is that Harry as a presence in Dexter's adult life functions as a conscience. Not in the traditional sense. Harry's conscience doesn't exactly produce conventional moral conclusions, but as a sounding board. When Dexter is considering something that violates the code, Harry shows up. When Dexter is rationalizing something he shouldn't be doing, Harry asks the question that forces Dexter to look at what he's actually doing. It's a fascinating choice by the show. Harry is dead for essentially the entire series, and yet he is one of the most present characters in it, because he's been so thoroughly internalized. Dexter carries Harry everywhere, every kill room, every decision, every moment of doubt. The first suspicion is the one that never really ends. And there's one more layer to Harry's story that the series adds late. through the Vogel revelation. The code wasn't just something Harry thought up. It emerged from years of consultation, of genuine intellectual labor between a homicide detective and a neuropsychiatrist. The idea that Dexter's operational framework had this professional architecture behind it, that it wasn't just a father improvising desperately with a troubled child, but a structured intervention designed by people who understood what they were dealing with, adds a weight to it that changes how you see the whole series on a rewatch. The code isn't just Harry's love. It's an experiment. Dexter's the result of it. And now, decades later, the results are in. There is a moment in the very first episode of Dexter that sets the tone for everything that follows. It's a small moment, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Dexter's doing his usual thing, walking through Miami Metro, carrying donuts, smiling at everyone, being cheerful in that slightly performative way he has. And then Sergeant James Dokes appears, and the whole energy of the scene shifts. Dokes doesn't smile back. He doesn't engage in small talk. He looks at Dexter the way you might look at something that's out of place, but you can't quite articulate why. And Dexter, in one of the great pieces of internal monologue in the whole series, asks himself, in a building full of trained investigators, all supposedly with some insight into human behavior, why is Dokes the only one who gives him the creeps right back? It's a question that deserves a proper answer. Because Dokes isn't suspicious of Dexter because he's done good detective work, not in season 1. He's suspicious because he recognizes something. James Dokes served in Army Special Forces before he became a cop. He'd been in situations where the rules about when it's acceptable to end someone's life were a lot more flexible than anything in the Miami Metro Handbook. He knew what it looked and felt like to be in the company of someone who had taken a life and had some complicated relationship with what that meant. And when he looked at Dexter, he saw the outline of that. Not the specifics, not the kill room or the blood slides or any of the operational detail, just the shape of it. The particular quality that Dexter carries and that nobody else in the building has the reference point to perceive. Dokes had the reference point. That's the whole thing, really. What makes the Dokes storyline so good across seasons 1 and 2 is that it never lets you forget he's right. Every time Dexter successfully deflects him, every time Dokes comes across as the aggressor and Dexter comes across as the reasonable one, the show holds the irony carefully. Because Dokes isn't being paranoid or irrational. He is the only person in the building doing his job correctly, and the fact that he looks like the problem is part of how Dexter survives. Season 1 is mostly about Dokes maintaining a low-level surveillance of Dexter, monitoring his movements, questioning his whereabouts, watching him in a way that makes Dexter visibly uncomfortable. Dokes even has a conversation at one point where he tells another officer, essentially, that he thinks Dexter is hiding something. And the officer just kind of shrugs, because Dexter is the friendly blood spatter guy with the donuts, and Dokes is the intense one with the officer-involved shootings. On paper, Dexter looks more normal. That's by design. Then Season 2 arrives, and with it the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation. A collection of bodies pulled from the ocean, all of them criminals, all of them killed in a very specific and highly skilled way. The FBI sends Special Agent Frank Lundy to Run Point, and suddenly Dexter is juggling not just Dokes, but a federal investigation that is uncomfortably building a fairly accurate profile of him without knowing it. Dokes, in the meantime, has started properly following Dexter, not just watching him at work, actually following him. And when Dexter realizes this, a significant portion of his energy in the early part of Season 2 goes toward managing Dokes' surveillance rather than his actual murders. He has to be careful about when he goes out, where he goes, how he covers his tracks. Dokes is making his life genuinely difficult in a way that nobody else has managed. The GPS tracker is where it gets serious. Dokes puts a tracking device on Dexter's boat, the Slice of Life, and waits. And Dexter, during what he thinks is a routine night of evidence disposal in the Everglades, suddenly finds a gun pointed at him by a man who has just watched him carry body parts to a boat. Dokes has caught him. Not with a theory, not with circumstantial evidence, not with a hunch, with his own eyes in the dark at the cabin. What follows is one of the stranger and more interesting sequences in the show. Dexter manages to subdue Dokes. Dokes shoots him in the leg first, which Dexter shrugs off with impressive speed, and then puts him in a cage. A literal cage, the kind that had been used in the cabin to store drugs. And then the two of them just talk for several episodes, with Dokes in the cage and Dexter bringing him food, and the two of them having these odd, uncomfortable, honest conversations about what they are. Because that's what Dokes wants to know. Not just what Dexter does, but what he is. Why he does it, whether he takes pleasure in it. And Dexter, who spends almost the entire series carefully managing what he reveals about himself to everyone around him, finds himself in a situation where there's no point lying anymore. The man knows, so they talk. And the conversations are genuinely fascinating because Dokes keeps poking at the differences between them. He's killed people too, but in service of something, under orders, within a system. And Dexter keeps poking back, pointing out that Dokes has had more officer-involved shootings than anyone else in Miami Metro. And maybe the line between them isn't quite as clean as Dokes would like to think. I don't know. No notes on those scenes, honestly. They're strange and uncomfortable and oddly compelling, and I think they're some of the best character work in the whole series. Meanwhile, outside the cabin, the investigation is proceeding. Lundy is building his case. The blood slides Dexter planted in Dokes' car have been found. The official narrative is solidifying. Dokes is the Bay Harbor butcher. He's fled the country. The case is essentially solved. Laguerta doesn't believe it. We'll get to her in a bit. But the institutional momentum is all pointing one way. Dexter knows he should probably kill Dokes. He knows that keeping him alive in a cabin in the Everglades is not a long-term plan. He can't let him go. Dokes will tell everyone what he knows the second he's free. He can't relocate him indefinitely. The logical endpoint of the cage situation is Dokes' death. And Dexter keeps circling that conclusion and not quite arriving at it. Because killing Dokes would mean killing a cop, a colleague, someone whose family would notice immediately. And then Lila arrives, and the decision is made for him. Lila West, Dexter's sponsor from his fake Narcotics Anonymous attendants, who has attached herself to him with an intensity that should have been a red flag from the start, had Dexter's GPS device. She'd stolen it because that's the sort of thing Lila does, and she followed it to the cabin. And when she found Dokes in the cage and Dokes told her that Dexter was the Bay Harbor butcher, she processed this information and arrived at the conclusion that Dexter was her soulmate and that the correct response was to help him. She blew up the propane, with Dokes still inside. She turned on a gas hob, opened the valve on a propane tank, and walked away. The resulting explosion destroyed the cabin and killed Dokes. When the police arrived to investigate, the official interpretation was that Dokes, knowing the net was closing, had taken his own life. Masuka even points out that a man as capable as Dokes would never have accidentally let propane leak, and therefore it must have been deliberate, which is an impressive bit of logical reasoning that arrives at the wrong conclusion. The aftermath of Dokes' death is grim in a very specific way. He gets framed. Posthumously, thoroughly, with his reputation and his career and his name attached to crimes he didn't commit. Laguerta, who knew him better than anyone, is left fighting a battle she can't win, trying to prove a dead man's innocence while her department officially closes the case. And Dexter, who in some private way respected Dokes precisely because Dokes was the one person who genuinely saw him, walks away from the Everglades and goes back to Miami and goes back to work. James Dokes is right about everything from the moment he appears on screen. He's right for 2 full seasons. And because of a combination of institutional momentum, an unstable woman with a crush, and Dexter's talent for managing perception, being right doesn't save him. There's something particularly uncomfortable about that. Not just as a plot point, but as a thing to sit with. The person who most deserved to be believed was never going to be believed because of who he was and how he presented and what Dexter had spent years constructing around himself. Dokes shouting from a cage in the Everglades is a useful image for that. He had all the information. He had nobody to tell it to. Something I've always appreciated about the Dokes storyline is how the show handles the institutional dynamics around it. Dokes is not, on paper, a sympathetic figure to his colleagues. His officer-involved shooting record is the highest in the department. He's aggressive, confrontational, occasionally frightening. When he starts acting obviously hostile toward Dexter, following him, confronting him at his desk, questioning everything he does, the department reads it as Dokes being Dokes. Difficult, volatile, grudge-bearing. Nobody asks why. Nobody sits down and says, "All right, James. What specifically has made you suspicious of this man?" Because Dokes doesn't present in a way that invites that conversation. Dexter understands this. He understands it very well. And in one of the show's most uncomfortable moves, he uses it. When Dokes is in the cage, when the investigation is closing in and the blood slides have been found in Dokes' car, Dexter goes into the FBI briefing and says, calmly in front of everyone, that he always sensed something off about Dokes, that this explains the antagonism, and the room accepts this, because Dexter is calm and reasonable, and the guy who brings donuts and Dokes is the one in the airport parking lot with blood slides in his boot. The injustice of it is very deliberately constructed. You're supposed to feel the wrongness of it. And the show earns the discomfort precisely because it never lets you forget that Dokes was right. What the cage scenes give us, in between all of that, is probably the most honest, extended conversation about Dexter's nature that exists anywhere in the original series. Dokes doesn't want to philosophize. He wants to understand. He keeps asking why. Not just why Dexter does it, but what it means to him. Whether he enjoys it, whether he feels anything. And Dexter, who has spent the whole series being carefully opaque about those questions, even in his own internal monologue, is surprisingly honest with Dokes. Maybe because there's no point in the pretense anymore. Maybe because Dokes is the first person who has genuinely wanted to know, rather than wanting to believe a comfortable version. The dynamic between them is strange, and I think underrated in discussions of the show. Two people who have done terrible things, both interrogating the other's relationship to those things, neither quite willing to concede the similarity the other is pointing to. Dexter tries to get Dokes to admit that his own violence, the shootings, the special forces operations, the quality of satisfaction he's noticed in himself after particularly intense encounters, is closer to Dexter's darkness than Dokes wants to admit. And Dokes, who is an honest man even in this situation, doesn't fully deny it. He just insists that the context makes it different. The law, the mandate, the system he operates within. And Dexter asks quietly whether a system's blessing is really what makes violence acceptable. It doesn't resolve, it just keeps going until Lila makes it stop. There's something almost poignant about the fact that those conversations are the longest Dexter ever gets to be fully honest with anyone outside of his internal monologue. Even with Deb, in season 7, the honesty is reactive. He's answering her questions, not volunteering himself. With Dokes in the cage, Dexter is doing something closer to thinking out loud, as if the pressure of being caught, of being seen, has released something that the performance ordinarily keeps contained. The tragedy is that Dokes was the right person to catch Dexter, not Lundy with his profile, not Lagerta with her evidence, not Angela with her case files. Dokes, who knew what he knew in his body before he could put words to it. He was the right person, and he ended up in a cage, and then in an explosion, and then in a file as the official villain of a story he was the closest thing to a hero in. Frank Lundy is an interesting case because he comes at Dexter from a completely different direction than Dokes. Dokes was instinct and recognition. Lundy is methodology and patience. He's a federal agent who has spent his career building cases on serial killers, and when he arrives in Miami in season 2 to investigate the Bay Harbor butcher, he's genuinely good at his job. uncomfortably good given what we know. His profiling work on the BHB is solid, actually. He correctly identifies the victims as criminals who evaded justice. He recognizes the bloodslide as trophies, which tells him something important about the killer's psychology. He profiles the Bay Harbor butcher as someone with law enforcement experience or connections. Someone who knows how investigations work because the disposal method is too clean, too considered, too aware of forensic procedure for a civilian. That last bit is worth pausing on. Lundy essentially builds a profile that points directly at someone inside Miami Metro. And yet, because Dexter has spent years as the friendly, slightly nerdy forensics guy who everyone likes, and because Doak's aggressive behavior and military background slot neatly into the profile, the investigation tilts toward Doak's and stays there. Dexter even helps it along. When Lundy and Captain Matthews lay out their case that Doak's is the butcher, Dexter sits in the room and agrees, saying he always sensed something off about Doak's, which is an extraordinary bit of audacity, contributing to the framing of the person who correctly suspected you. Lundy leaves Miami when the case closes and Doak's is officially named. He seems satisfied, not triumphant, but professionally settled. The job is done, or appears to be. He comes back in season 4, and this time he's chasing the Trinity killer, which is a separate case and a genuinely impressive piece of investigative work on Lundy's part. The Trinity pattern, the same 3 victims in the same order, the bathtub, the building, the blunt object, repeated across multiple cities over 30 years, is something he identified basically alone when nobody else in the FBI took it seriously enough to open a formal case. He came to Miami because he believed Trinity was there. He was right. Trinity was there. The show gives us this horrible dramatic irony again. Dexter and Lundy are, in season 4, both hunting the same man, and they keep almost crossing paths in ways that should have led to a conversation but don't. There's a version of season 4 where Dexter and Lundy pool their information, where Lundy's 30 years of case files meet Dexter's street-level investigation, and between them they close the case in half the time. But Dexter can't share what he knows without explaining how he knows it. And Lundy, working through official channels, doesn't have the kind of access to Trinity's daily patterns that Dexter has accumulated by inserting himself directly into Arthur Mitchell's life. It's one of the show's most effective uses of the dramatic irony structure. 2 investigators working the same case, each with information the other doesn't have, unable to collaborate because one of them has a secret that would make the collaboration impossible. The fact that the collision between them never happens, because Christine Hill stops it before it can, is both a plot necessity and a genuinely tragic near miss. Lundy is killed before that conversation can happen, shot by Christine Hill, who turns out to be Trinity's daughter, who is trying to protect her father. Deb, who was standing next to him when it happened, was also shot. She survived. Lundy didn't. And that's where Lundy's story ends, which is genuinely frustrating in the way that good storytelling sometimes is, because Lundy was one of the few people in this show who was actually competent at the thing he was supposed to be doing. He never got close to Dexter personally. His suspicion was structural rather than targeted. But his profile of the Bay Harbor butcher was accurate enough that in a slightly different universe, he might have followed the thread all the way back. He was right. He was building something real. He just had the bad luck of getting it right. The sad detail is that he came to Miami twice and left Miami twice, and the thing he was looking for was doing his forensics both times. What I find interesting about Lundy as a character is how the show uses him structurally. He arrives, does good work, and then leaves. Both times, he's never quite embedded enough to follow a thread all the way to its conclusion. In season 2, he identifies Doak's as the butcher and considers the case solved when Doak's dies, which is professionally reasonable given the evidence available. In season 4, he's killed before he can build anything actionable in Trinity. So his intelligence and his methodological skill never get a fair chance to run their course, because circumstances keep intervening. There's a version of this show, a slightly more realistic version, where Lundy stays in Miami, where he doesn't accept the Doak's conclusion quite as cleanly, where he keeps asking questions even after the case is officially closed, the way Lagerta does. Given his experience and his track record, he might have arrived at the same bloodslide realization that Lagerta eventually arrives at. He might have connected the dots differently. He was certainly capable of it. But he's killed by Christine Hill, who is acting to protect her father. Arthur Mitchell, whose 30-year killing career Lundy had spent years trying to prove existed. There's a specific cruelty in that. The one investigator who might have been able to connect Trinity and the Bay Harbor butcher, who was simultaneously in Miami while both were active, is removed from the picture by a third party acting on entirely separate motivations. It has nothing to do with Dexter in the end. The thing that kills Lundy's investigation is a family loyalty he had no way of anticipating. The show is full of those intersections, events that protect Dexter without Dexter doing anything to cause them. He benefits from the institutional inertia around Doakes. He benefits from Christine Hill's decision to protect her father. He benefits from Quinn's love for Deborah. He is, for a man who has to be very careful, also extraordinarily lucky. Though I suppose spending most of your career in a homicide department means you're always within arm's reach of someone with a reason to create chaos that inadvertently covers your tracks. Lila is a different kind of entry on this list because she doesn't fit the usual pattern. She isn't an investigator. She isn't following evidence. She's a deeply unstable woman who becomes obsessively attached to Dexter during his fake narcotics anonymous phase in season 2, and who eventually discovers the truth about him not through deduction but by literally following a GPS signal to a cabin in the Everglades and finding James Doakes in a cage. So she knows everything. Doakes tells her, he says directly, Dexter is the Bay Harbor butcher. This is not a theory or a suspicion. It's a statement from the man who tracked him, caught him, and has been sitting in a cage discussing it with him for days. And Lila's response to this information is to decide that she and Dexter are essentially the same kind of person and that she should protect him. She blows up the propane. She walks away. She never tells anyone. What's interesting about Lila in retrospect is that she represents this edge case where knowing the truth doesn't produce a desire to stop it. It produces a desire to participate. She processes Dexter's secret as evidence of depth, of darkness, of a soul that matches her own. She's genuinely moved by it, which says quite a lot about Lila and about the particular quality of her attachment to Dexter, none of which is particularly healthy. Dexter, for his part, has already worked out that Lila is more dangerous than useful. He tells her at the aquarium that they're the same, that he has no emotions, that he feels nothing, as a setup for what he's actually planning, which is to kill her. She thinks they're making plans to leave Miami together. He's working out the logistics of her murder. Layla, for all her perceptiveness about Dexter's darkness, doesn't see that coming. She ends up in Paris. Dexter kills her there, in her flat, leaving the body for the authorities to find. She'd gone after Rita and the children by then, set fire to Angel's flat with people inside it, and the code was satisfied. She goes down as a missing person briefly. There's a very small investigation. Nothing comes of it. She knew. She chose silence. She spent the last part of her life thinking Dexter was her kindred spirit, while he was calmly working out when and where to end her. It's a grim arc, honestly. The more I think about Lila's role in the suspicion conversation, the more I think she's doing something the show doesn't always get credit for. She's showing us what happens when the truth is discovered by the wrong person. Not wrong in a moral sense, necessarily, but wrong in the sense that her relationship to the truth is completely corrupted by her relationship to Dexter. She can't process it cleanly because she doesn't want to. The information passes through the filter of her obsession and comes out the other side, transformed into something that justifies her attachment rather than challenging it. That's actually a fairly sophisticated thing for the show to do, because we spend most of the series watching people try to find evidence that Dexter is what we already know him to be. And the assumption is that finding that evidence would lead to a particular outcome: exposure, arrest, consequences. Lila demonstrates that the outcome isn't inevitable. Knowledge without the right relationship to it produces nothing useful. She had all the information, and she used it to blow up a propane tank. The other thing about Lila that's easy to forget, given that she's dead by the end of season 2, is how close she comes to becoming a long-term problem for Dexter. She goes after Rita and the kids. She sets fire to Angel's apartment with people inside it. She is, in her own way, genuinely dangerous. And the code that Dexter operates under, and which requires that he verify guilt before acting, means he has to spend a frustrating amount of season 2 gathering sufficient justification to do what he already knows he has to do. Lila, who has no code and no particular constraints, can just act. She eventually ends up in Paris because she goes there to hide from Dexter's investigation of her, which doesn't work, obviously, but the detail that she goes international, crosses an ocean, and still doesn't get away says something about how thorough Dexter is when he's decided someone needs to be dealt with. She knew everything about him, and she still underestimated what that meant for her own safety. Brian is a unique case on this list because he isn't discovering anything. He's confirming something he already knew. Brian Moser, the ice truck killer, though that name always sounds slightly more whimsical than his actual crimes warrant, is Dexter's biological brother. They were in the same shipping container when their mother was killed. They were both 3 years old. And whatever was created in that container, whatever psychological architecture gets built in a child who witnesses that kind of violence at that age, they both have some version of it. The difference is what happened next. Dexter was found by Harry and given the code and raised in a family. Brian went into the system, group homes, institutions, presumably a fairly bleak decade or so before he emerged as a fully operational serial killer with a very specific aesthetic. When Brian reappears in season 1 as the ice truck killer, he's not trying to catch Dexter, he's trying to reach him. The taunts he leaves are specific. Too specific, calibrated for someone who thinks the way Dexter thinks. The drained, bloodless bodies, the deliberate staging. He's not leaving clues for the police. He's leaving messages for his brother. He knows exactly what Dexter is because he is the same thing, more or less, with different choices made at different crossroads. The reveal that Rudy, Dexter's sister's boyfriend, charming, slightly too perfect, is Brian Moser is one of the show's great early season moments, because in retrospect you can see it all. Every choice Brian made that season was oriented toward Dexter. Getting close to Deb was a way of getting close to Dexter. The killings were a form of communication. What Brian wanted, I think, was for Dexter to acknowledge what they both are. To drop the pretense of the blood spatter analyst, the foster family, the carefully constructed normal life, and just be what he is with his brother. Brian had no code, no Harry, no framework of justification. He killed randomly, creatively, without the moral scaffolding that gives Dexter his sense of purpose. And there's a reading of Brian's whole season 1 arc as a man trying to convince his brother to abandon a set of constraints he finds unnecessary. Dexter kills him. In the end, after everything, Dexter slits his brother's throat and stages it as a suicide. And he makes the choice to protect the life he has, Deborah, Miami Metro, the code, the carefully maintained surface, over the genuine connection his brother is offering. It's not an easy moment, even though the show contextualizes it clearly enough. Brian killed people. He was going to keep killing people. The code is satisfied, but there's a cost to it that Dexter carries. Brian appears in visions later. He never quite goes away. The brother who knew everything about him and who Dexter couldn't choose. What I keep coming back to with Brian is the question of what his approach to Dexter's secret tells us about how the show understands recognition. Dokes recognizes Dexter because of his own history with violence in service of the state. Brian recognizes Dexter because of shared DNA and shared trauma. In both cases, the recognition is immediate and total. Neither of them needs evidence. Neither of them conducts an investigation. They just look at him and know. The show is making a point about this, I think. The people who identify Dexter most quickly are the ones who are most like him in some respect. Not morally. Lundy is a morally upright man who builds a good profile and still doesn't land on Dexter personally, but experientially. People who have encountered real darkness in themselves or in the world around them, and who therefore recognize the shape of it when they see it wearing a friendly face. Brian's method of revelation is worth noting too. He doesn't expose Dexter, he doesn't try to. His taunts are aimed at Dexter alone, a communication in a language only the two of them share. He kills women in a specific way, drains them of blood, leaves them arranged like display pieces. It's not random violence, it's a letter. He is, across the whole of Season 1, writing his brother a very long and very disturbing letter about who they both are and what that means, and waiting to see if Dexter will write back. The tragedy is that Dexter does, in a sense. He engages. He spends Season 1 genuinely uncertain about what to do with Brian, which is a rarity. Dexter is usually certain. He hesitates in ways he doesn't hesitate with other targets. And in the end, the letter he sends back is Brian's death, staged as something ordinary, which might be the saddest possible response to someone who only ever wanted to be acknowledged. One more thing about Brian worth noting: the victims. The ice truck killer's victims are drained of blood, posed, arranged. They're bloodless, which as a message to a blood spatter analyst is almost comically specific. Brian isn't just killing women. He's sending Dexter something that's legible only to someone who thinks about blood the way Dexter thinks about blood. The absence of it where it should be. The particular quality of a body that's been so thoroughly processed. It's a calling card in a language that Miami Metro can analyze forensically without understanding what it actually says. That specificity, the way Brian's communication system operates completely over the heads of the official investigation while speaking directly to Dexter, is one of the more elegant structural choices in Season 1. The show creates a mystery that looks like one thing from the outside and is something entirely different on the inside. And Dexter, who understands both registers, is caught between them, professionally obligated to investigate a killer while personally understanding the investigation as correspondence from his brother. He could have found a way to stop it earlier, could have led the department to Brian faster. He doesn't, for reasons he doesn't fully articulate even to himself. The code requires guilt. He has to be certain. But the certainty arrives later than it might have, and part of that is that some quiet part of Dexter didn't want to close the conversation quite yet. Right, so, Lagerta. If James Dokes is the most right-from-the-start suspicion story in the franchise, Maria Lagerta is the most persistent, the one that spans the longest time, involves the most careful investigative work, and ends in the most devastating way. She is, arguably, the character in the original series who comes closest to ending Dexter Morgan, and she does it almost entirely through the quality of not being willing to accept the official version of events. Her suspicion has two phases. The first is in Season 2, running parallel to the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation. LaGuardia refuses, from the beginning, to believe that Dokes is the Bay Harbor Butcher. Not because she has specific evidence that he isn't, at this point she doesn't, but because she knew Dokes. She worked beside him for years. She knew the texture of his violence, the shape of his darkness, and the Bay Harbor Butcher doesn't match it. Dokes was volatile, yes, dangerous, yes, but he wasn't this. He didn't have the patience for it. She couldn't say exactly why the profile didn't fit, but it didn't. The department moves on. The case is officially closed. Lagerta is told in various ways and at various levels of directness to let it go. And she does on the surface, in the way that certain people let things go. By filing them away and not discussing them anymore while quietly keeping the file. The second phase begins in Season 7, years later when a charred blood slide is found at a church crime scene. Dexter had killed Travis Marshall there, the Doomsday Killer. And in the chaos of that night, a blood slide was left behind. LaGuerta has the slide tested privately at a different lab without telling anyone. The results tell her that the blood inside the slide belongs to Travis Marshall, which means the Bay Harbor butcher left a trophy at a scene years after Dokes supposedly committed suicide to avoid arrest, which means either the Bay Harbor butcher is still alive, or James Dokes was never the Bay Harbor butcher. LaGuerta pulls Frank Lundy's old notebooks. She starts cross-referencing cases. She looks at the timeline of BHB victims and maps them against Dexter's history. His childhood, his connection to the shipping container where his mother died, his brother Brian becoming the ice truck killer. She even brings Captain Matthews into it eventually, outlining her theory, watching him respond in ways that tell her he already knows something he's not sharing. This is genuinely impressive police work. LaGuerta, who the show often uses as a political animal, someone interested in her career, her reputation, her positioning within the department, drops all of that in season 7 and just does the job. She goes where the evidence leads. She pursues leads that could blow up her career if she's wrong. She arrests Dexter, actually marches him through Miami Metro in handcuffs. On the strength of evidence she's spent most of the season assembling. The moment where she says she has proof that Dexter is the Bay Harbor butcher and Angel Batista tells her she's out of her mind is one of the more effective moments in the whole season, because by that point, watching what we've watched, we know she's right and he's wrong. Dexter's response to LaGuerta's investigation is impressive in its own way and deeply unpleasant. He plants evidence. He stages a fake boat storage unit with Dokes' fingerprint on a knife to make it look like Dokes really was the Bay Harbor butcher. He sets LaGuerta up to look like she's framing him, which causes her own department to side against her. He even manages to make Deb, who knows the truth, complicit in protecting him because Deb can't bring herself to let her brother go down for it. LaGuerta knows what Dexter is doing. In the interrogation room scene, after Masuka exonerates Dexter using evidence Dexter himself planted, she confronts him in the elevator, just the two of them. She tells him that Dokes always knew something was wrong with him, and she can see now that Dokes was right. And Dexter doesn't deny it, he just looks at her. It's a horrible scene in a good way. The finale of season 7 takes place in a shipping container at the docks. LaGuerta has set a trap using Hector Estrada, the man who killed Dexter's mother, who Dexter has been trying to get to all season, as bait. She knows Dexter can't resist it. She's there waiting. She has a gun. And Dexter is there, and Deb is there, and it comes down to a standoff where LaGuerta, bleeding from a wound Dexter's inflicted, tells Deborah to shoot Dexter, points out that he's a serial killer, appeals to everything Deb knows is true. Deb shoots LaGuerta, not Dexter. LaGuerta. It's one of the most wrenching moments in the whole series, and I still think about it fairly often. Because LaGuerta had it right. She had years of evidence, a clear theory, the correct conclusion. She had Dexter at gunpoint, and she still lost because the person who could have chosen to believe her instead chose her brother. She was right about everything, and she died for it. I want to spend a bit more time on the mechanics of LaGuerta's Season 7 investigation because I think it's underappreciated as a piece of detective work. She has very little to go on when she starts. A blood slide from a church fire, a hunch, years of quietly maintained suspicion about James Dokes' posthumous guilt. That's it. And from that starting point, she builds something that by the end of the season is a genuinely formidable case. She goes back to basics, she pulls Dokes' files, she looks at who he was, what his capacity for this kind of sustained, methodical operation actually was, and concludes again, and with fresh eyes, that it doesn't fit. She reaches out to Frank Lundy's old contacts. She requisitions Bay Harbor butcher evidence that had been filed and forgotten. She uses a private forensic lab rather than the Miami Metro lab because she correctly identifies that if Dexter's in the department's lab isn't a safe place to process evidence she doesn't want him to see. The private lab is actually the smartest move in the whole investigation. LaGuerta, working from the assumption that the killer might be inside Miami Metro, immediately understands the procedural implication. She can't trust the institution, she has to work around it, which is precisely what Dexter has been doing for his entire career from the other side. There's a symmetry to that which the show doesn't underline, but which is there if you look for it. Her investigation of Hector Estrada is particularly well constructed. Estrada was one of the men who killed Dexter's mother all those years ago. Connected to the original crime scene, connected to the story of Dexter's origin, and LaGuerta's discovery that Estrada had been quietly released from prison while Dexter was in the department is the thread that pulls the sweater apart. She uses Estrada as bait. She knows Dexter will want him. She counts on the fact that something this personal, this connected to his own history will override his usual caution. She's right about that too. The Estrada gambit is actually quite sophisticated as a piece of investigative strategy. LaGuerta isn't just setting a trap, she's profiling. She's worked out that Dexter operates according to a pattern of personal motivation as well as professional method, and she's identified the one target where that personal motivation is strong enough to override his caution. The man who killed his mother is out of prison. LaGuerta knows Dexter knows. She knows what he'll do about it. She's essentially predicting a kill. That's the kind of investigative thinking that Lundy was doing in his profiling work, but applied specifically and personally. LaGuerta doesn't have Lundy's FBI training or his formal expertise in serial killer psychology. What she has is 12 years of working in the same department as Dexter Morgan, plus the specific clarity that comes from finally letting yourself believe the thing you've been half believing for years. Once she fully committed to the theory, once she stopped telling herself she was probably wrong, she became a formidable investigator of this specific target. The confrontation at the shipping container is the culmination of all of it. She's wounded, she's armed, she has Deborah Morgan in front of her. And she makes her case, not with hysteria, not with the emotional overwhelm you might expect from someone who's been fighting this battle more or less alone for years. She makes it plainly. Dexter's a serial killer. Deborah knows. There is a correct course of action. One of them should take it. She's right about all of that. Every word of it is accurate, and it still doesn't save her. The interrogation room scene in season 7, where she lays out her evidence against Dexter and he dismantles it piece by piece using planted evidence, is one of the more satisfying sequences in the whole later run of the series, precisely because both of them are at the top of their game. LaGuerta presenting a case that is, in substance, completely correct. Dexter having anticipated this exact scenario and prepared a countermove so thorough that even Masuka, who runs the tests in good faith, produces results that exonerate him. And both LaGuerta and Dexter at the end of it, knowing exactly what happened. She says as much in the elevator that Dokes always knew something was wrong with him, that she knows it now. The shipping container ending is the show making a choice about what the story means. LaGuerta could have been wrong. The show could have arranged things so that her case collapses under its own weight, or she walks away frustrated but alive. Instead, it has her right, and it puts her in the same space as Dexter and Deborah, and it forces the show's most morally compromised moment on a character who had been positioned as the difficult one, the political animal, the self-serving lieutenant. LaGuerta, in her final scene, is utterly without self-interest. She is asking Deborah to do the right thing. She is making the case, clearly and without manipulation, for the correct course of action. And Deborah shoots her. The show trusts you to hold the wrongness of that. It doesn't soften it or justify it. It just puts it there and lets it stand. And the weight of it is one of the things that defines everything that comes after. And here, between LaGuerta's story and Quinn's, feels like a natural moment to mention. If you've been enjoying this so far and you're not already subscribed, it really does help the channel. These long-form pieces take a fair bit of time to put together, and knowing people are watching and listening makes it worth doing more of them. There's a lot more Dexter content planned, so if that sounds good, the subscribe button is right there. But now, Back to the people who suspected Dexter Morgan, in a very different kind of story from Lagerta's. The night Rita died, something shifted in Quinn. He watched Dexter navigate the immediate aftermath, the police station, the questions, the grief, with this particular quality of distance that troubled him. Not just stoicism, something else, something Quinn, who had spent years reading people under pressure, couldn't quite place but couldn't quite dismiss either. Quinn is a messy, morally ambiguous detective who doesn't always do the right thing, but he has decent instincts when he pays attention. And his instincts, right after Rita's murder, were telling him that Dexter Morgan was hiding something. It starts in season 4, right after Rita's murder. Quinn had watched Dexter navigate Rita's death with this particular quality of emotional distance that troubled him. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, something else, something he couldn't name. And then there were the circumstances of how Rita died, the Trinity killer, and the fact that Dexter had been chasing Trinity independently without telling the department. Quinn started connecting things, or trying to connect them, and reached the conclusion that Dexter was involved in something he wasn't saying. He took his suspicion to Stan Liddy, a disgraced cop, out on suspension from internal affairs, someone who had nothing better to do and plenty of reasons to want to prove he was still capable of useful work. Quinn gave Liddy money to run a quiet investigation on Dexter, not official, nothing on record. Just watch him, build a picture, see what you find. Liddy turned out to be good at this. He set up surveillance. He got footage of Dexter and Lumen, who Dexter was at this point working with on the Barrel Girls case, carrying black bags at night. He planted a camera in what he suspected was a location Dexter used for something. He accumulated a file, not a complete file, not something that would hold up in court, but enough to be concerning. And Quinn, as this file was building, started to lose his nerve. Part of this is Deborah. Quinn was in a relationship with Deb throughout season 5, and pursuing her brother as a murder suspect was obviously incompatible with that. Part of it is that Liddy, as he got more invested in the case, started making demands, more money, more resources, official backing, that Quinn couldn't and wouldn't provide. Liddy's investigation was starting to feel like something Quinn couldn't control. And Quinn's fundamental preference throughout his time on the show is for the path of least resistance. The confrontation in the van is where it all collapses. Liddy had finally gotten what he needed: surveillance footage, a recording, something he thought was a confession, and he summoned Quinn to meet him. Except Dexter got there first. He injected Liddy with M99, overpowered him during the recording session, and killed him. Stabbed him in the chest with his own knife, and when Quinn showed up at the van, a drop of Liddy's blood, one single drop, landed on Quinn's shoe without Quinn noticing. The blood on the shoe becomes a brief but genuinely tense subplot. LaGuerta spots it. Quinn gets hauled in, the test is run, and somehow, because Dexter had already worked out what was happening and arranged a switch, the test comes back negative. Quinn is cleared. He deletes Liddy's voicemails from his phone, destroys whatever loose threads he can reach, and lets the whole thing die. What's interesting is what happens afterward. Quinn doesn't go back to investigating Dexter. He essentially closes that chapter and doesn't reopen it. He and Dexter exist in each other's professional lives for several more seasons with this specific quality of mutual awareness. They both know roughly what the other knows, but neither pushes it. Quinn, by the end of the show, has made a kind of peace with not knowing, or not wanting to know. It's never quite clear which. He's the investigation that stopped itself. The man who saw enough to be worried, then decided the worry was too expensive. What I find most honest about Quinn's arc is that the show doesn't condemn him for it, exactly. It's not presented as a heroic choice or a good one, but it's presented as a human one. Quinn is not a bad detective. He's actually reasonably effective when he's engaged. But he's a man who has always found pragmatic ways to manage inconvenient truths. The idea that Deb's brother is a serial killer is an inconvenient truth of a scale that most people would struggle with. And Quinn's response, backing away slowly until the threat feels smaller, is more understandable than it is admirable. The dynamic between Quinn and Dexter after all of this is one of the more quietly interesting things in the later seasons. They work together, they share a professional space, they occasionally eat lunch in the same room, and there's this layer underneath every interaction and this mutual awareness of what was looked for and what was almost found that neither of them ever directly addresses. Dexter knows what Quinn did. Quinn knows that Dexter knows, and they just keep coming to work. It's actually a very good portrait of how people compartmentalize things. Quinn chose the version of reality that he could live in, and he lives in it. He doesn't think about Liddy much, presumably. He doesn't revisit the surveillance footage in his mind at night, or not for long. He chooses not to, and eventually the choosing becomes habit, and the habit becomes just how things are. I don't want to be too hard on Quinn for this, and I mean that genuinely. The show gives him a pretty clear picture of what the alternative would have looked like. Lagerta pursues the truth and ends up in a shipping container. Dokes pursues the truth and ends up in a cage and then an explosion. The people who keep looking at Dexter Morgan tend to come to bad ends, and Quinn, whatever his faults, is good at self-preservation. The fact that self-preservation in this case also happened to let a serial killer continue operating is the uncomfortable corollary that the show acknowledges without making Quinn carry it as heavy guilt. He doesn't have the full picture. He can't quite bring himself to complete the picture, and that gap between what he suspects and what he knows is where he lives. The blood on the shoe is the detail I always come back to. Quinn arriving at the scene of Liddy's murder without knowing it's Liddy's murder is so close to the full truth that he's wearing evidence of it on his shoe. A single drop. And he doesn't notice, doesn't look down, doesn't follow that particular thread. It's the show's visual shorthand for his entire relationship to the investigation, standing right next to the answer and not quite seeing it. Liddy doesn't get much screen time in the grand scheme of things, and he's not a sympathetic character. He's mercenary, slightly sleazy, more interested in his own professional rehabilitation than in any kind of justice. But in terms of pure investigative effectiveness, he's arguably more dangerous to Dexter in Season 5 than almost anyone outside the Lagerta storyline. The thing about Liddy is that he approaches Dexter the way a professional would. Not with instinct, not with a personal connection that clouds his judgment, but with method. He watches, he waits, he uses equipment rather than intuition. He identifies patterns in Dexter's behavior that don't match the official story of his life. The late nights, the black bags, the particular way he moves through certain situations. Liddy's famous line about Dexter, when Quinn first brings him in, is that the guy is too clean on paper. Drug dealers have the same profile. Too neat, too phony. And Liddy knows what too neat looks like because he spent his career around people with things to hide. The surveillance footage he accumulates is real. Dexter and Lumen are on it, doing things that would require significant explanation. The camera he plants inside Dexter's location captures footage that, combined with everything else in his file, could have opened a serious investigation. He confronts Dexter in the van. He tells him that without a search warrant, the footage isn't admissible. But if Dexter confesses, he'll let Lumen walk free. And Dexter, who has been tased and tied up in the back of a surveillance van, kicks Liddy in the face and slips out of his bonds and stabs him in the chest. Liddy's eyes go wide, the light goes out. Dexter throws the laptop into the bay and drives to the next problem. Liddy's investigation dies with him. Everything he had gathered, the footage, the file, the connections he'd made, disappears. Quinn deletes the voicemails. The case goes nowhere. And Liddy himself is found dead in his own van, officially filed as a crime probably connected to his earlier IA trouble. And that's more or less where the story ends. He was right. He was building something real. He just got too close before he had enough backup. And Dexter is, above all else, very good at identifying when someone is getting too close. There's a particular kind of danger in someone like Liddy that's different from the danger of institutional investigators. Lagerta had the department behind her, at least nominally. Internal procedures, records, colleagues who would eventually notice if she disappeared. Lundy had the FBI. Even Dokes, for a while, had the legitimacy of his badge. Liddy has none of that. He's operating off-book on private money from a cop who has his own reasons to want everything quiet. This means that when Dexter deals with him, there are no institutional consequences to manage, no colleagues who will ask questions, no official case to unpick. The van confrontation is worth describing in detail because it's a good piece of tension. Liddy has Dexter tased and tied in the back of a surveillance vehicle. He plays him footage. He tells him what he has. And Dexter, Kojo, who is, at this point, immobilized and completely at Liddy's mercy, very calmly assesses the situation. He notes that Liddy doesn't have a search warrant, which means the footage isn't admissible without a confession. He works out the geometry of the space, and then he kicks Liddy in the face. What follows is very quick and very efficient. Dexter has his hands free, Liddy has a knife, Dexter gets to the knife first, and it ends. The whole thing takes maybe 30 seconds. And then Dexter is standing over a dead man in a surveillance van with a laptop full of evidence he needs to destroy before anyone finds it. While Lumen is somewhere across the city in serious danger and his phone is buzzing with messages about his son's birthday party, he handles all of it. That's the thing about Dexter as a character, the scenes where he's managing multiple crises simultaneously are sometimes more revealing than the kill room scenes. He throws the laptop in the bay, he cleans up, he calls the county records office about Jordan Chase's property. He leaves for the next problem. The Liddy situation is closed. And that's how a man who had assembled the most accurate surveillance file on Dexter Morgan in Miami disappears from the narrative without consequence, without anyone properly understanding what he'd found or how close he'd been. His files go into the water, his instincts die with him. Isaac Serco comes at Dexter from a completely different direction than anyone else on this list, which is what makes his arc in Season 7 so interesting. He isn't law enforcement, he isn't family, he isn't someone with a personal history that creates an instinctive alarm around Dexter. He's a senior figure in the Koshka Brotherhood, Ukrainian organized crime, and his investigation of Dexter begins not because of who Dexter is, but because of what Dexter did. Specifically, Victor Baskov. Victor was Koshka Brotherhood. He killed a Miami Metro officer named Mike Anderson. And Dexter killed Victor at the airport in what looked, on the surface, like a clean disappearance. Victor was supposed to be on a flight. Instead, his remains went into the water. Isaac, receiving a call from the Foxhole's manager that Victor had left on an evening flight hours ago and never arrived, does not let this go. His investigation is methodical and well-resourced. He traces Victor's last known movements. He looks at who had access to the airport, who had reason to want Victor dead, who connects to the killing of Mike Anderson. He pulls records, he talks to people. He eventually tracks the thread back to Miami Metro and from Miami Metro to Dexter specifically, identifying him by name, learning that he and Lewis Green both worked forensics, and building a picture. The scene where Isaac is waiting in Dexter's apartment is genuinely unsettling. He's lying in wait, planning to capture and torture him for information. Not as punishment exactly, but as process. He wants to understand what happened to Victor. Dexter, coming home and noticing his curtains are open when they shouldn't be, works out the situation before he opens the door. He calls his home phone disguising his voice, leaves a fake message about meeting somewhere, and watches Isaac leave the apartment from across the street. What follows across Season 7 is this cat and mouse where Dexter and Isaac keep almost intersecting, keep missing each other by margins, keep operating on parallel tracks through the same city. And when they do finally end up in the same room, something interesting happens. Isaac is intelligent enough and perceptive enough, and has lived long enough in a world where violence is a professional tool, that he reads Dexter more accurately than most. He's not trying to understand the moral dimensions of what Dexter does. He's just trying to understand the person doing it. There's a grudging quality to their relationship by the end. Isaac is killed by Koshka Brotherhood hitmen before he can do anything with what he knows about Dexter. His own people had decided his loyalty to Victor made him a liability, which is its own bleak irony. He dies before the investigation he'd started produces anything useful, and Dexter, who had spent most of their interactions trying to stay alive, ends up feeling something adjacent to respect for the man who'd been hunting him. He was looking for the right person, he just ran out of time. What I find genuinely interesting about Isaac, beyond the surface of his arc, is what his investigation reveals about how Dexter looks from a completely different institutional perspective. The police see Dexter as a colleague, which creates its own blind spots. The FBI sees him as adjacent to their cases, a forensics expert to be consulted. Isaac sees him as a professional problem to be solved, with none of the social context that makes the people around Dexter so susceptible to his performance. He doesn't find Dexter charming. He doesn't find him trustworthy or friendly or particularly likable. He just finds him dangerous and effective, which is actually a more accurate reading than almost anyone else in the series manages. Isaac assesses Dexter correctly. This is someone who knows what they're doing, who is not who they appear to be, and who represents a significant operational risk. The fact that Isaac frames this in terms of organized crime rather than serial murder doesn't make the assessment wrong. Their subsequent relationship in Season 7 is unusual because at various points, Dexter and Isaac are working toward the same goal, removing a threat that both of them want removed. And there are conversations between them that have a quality of something like honest exchange. Isaac isn't interested in the moral dimensions of what Dexter does. He's interested in effectiveness, in consistency, in what a person is actually capable of. By those standards, he seems to find Dexter meets the bar. It's not warm exactly, but it's not dishonest either. The conversations between them have a texture that's unusual for the show. Most of Dexter's meaningful relationships involve him maintaining some form of performance, being the friendly forensics guy or the caring boyfriend or the devoted brother. With Isaac, there's no performance required because Isaac already knows what Dexter is and doesn't particularly care about anything else. It strips the dynamic down to something almost peaceful in its directness. Two professionals acknowledging what the other is, having the kind of conversation that's only possible when neither person needs anything from the other except honesty. Isaac is killed by hitmen sent by the Koshka Brotherhood, who have decided his attachment to Victor's memory is a liability. There's something quietly sad about that. A man who pursued justice for someone he loved, who had identified the right target and built the right case, ended not by Dexter but by his own people deciding he'd become inconvenient. Dexter had almost nothing to do with his death in the end, which is another version of the luck that runs through so much of this story. Arthur Mitchell is different from everyone else on this list in a way that I think the show handles really well. Because Arthur doesn't suspect Dexter the way an investigator suspects someone. He recognizes him, the way you might recognize your own reflection in an unexpected mirror and feel something complicated about it. Arthur Mitchell is the Trinity killer. 30 years of murders across dozens of cities. The same 3 victim pattern every time, building a house for charity in between. A respected member of his community. A church-going family man, an absolute nightmare to live with, as his wife and children could attest. He is, in many ways, the dark version of what Dexter could have been without Harry's code. The same fundamental thing, but without the framework that limits the targets. Dexter finds Arthur before the department does, and inserts himself into Arthur's life under a fake name, Kyle Butler, ostensibly so he can study him and figure out how Arthur has managed to sustain a normal family life while doing what he does. Dexter is genuinely curious about this in a way that's slightly troubling if you think about it too hard. The problem is that Arthur, who has spent 30 years successfully maintaining a double life of his own, is considerably better at reading people than most. He clocks that Kyle Butler isn't who he says he is. He's not sure what Kyle is exactly, not immediately, but he knows the pretense doesn't fit. And at some point, through a combination of street directories and old-fashioned curiosity, he looks up D. Morgan in the white pages and finds a listing for a Dexter Morgan in Miami. The scene where Arthur finds this is one of the more genuinely chilling moments in season 4. He's at his garage computer, he finds the name, and he starts to laugh. Not a villain laugh, not theatrical. Just this quiet, deeply uncomfortable sound of recognition and satisfaction. Because if Kyle Butler is actually Dexter Morgan, then Arthur has a move available to him. He goes to Dexter's house. While Dexter is elsewhere, believing he's finally found the right moment to take Arthur down, Arthur goes to the house in the Keys where Rita and Harrison are waiting. What happens next is one of the most devastating moments in the whole series. Dexter arrives at the hotel, triumphant, calls home, and then the camera cuts, and the next time we see Rita, the bath is red. Arthur's knowledge of who Dexter was didn't manifest as an investigation or an attempt to expose him. It manifested as a threat made real. He punished Dexter for getting close in the most irreversible way possible. That's what makes Arthur unique in this list. He wasn't trying to stop Dexter, he was trying to hurt him, and he knew exactly where to go to do it. The Trinity arc is, I think, the best season of Dexter, and a large part of that is because John Lithgow's performance gives Arthur a specificity that most antagonists in the show don't have. Arthur isn't a symbol or a type. He's a person, a deeply damaged, frightening, specific person who has managed to hold his family and his community and his double life together for 30 years through a combination of discipline, terror, and a kind of furious religious conviction. He built houses for charity. He went to church. His name was on plaques. He was admired. What Dexter finds when he inserts himself into Arthur's life as Kyle Butler is a man who is doing the thing Dexter thought he wanted, maintaining a family, a surface, a normal life, and doing it so badly that his wife and children live in constant fear of him. It's not the advertisement for domesticity that Dexter expected, and the show is honest about the lesson in it. You can't separate the monster from the man. Arthur's family didn't get a normal life and a hidden monster. They got the monster at the dinner table every evening. The moment Arthur identifies Kyle Butler as Dexter Morgan is the show at its sharpest, because Arthur doesn't immediately go to the police. He doesn't call anyone. He finds a white pages listing for D. Morgan in Miami, and he laughs, and then he thinks about what he can do with this information. The answer he arrives at is not exposure, it's retaliation. There's a logic to that which says something about what Arthur is. He doesn't want Dexter caught or punished through legitimate means. He wants Dexter to feel what Arthur has felt, to have something taken from him that can't be recovered. He understands correctly that Rita is the point of maximum vulnerability, and so he goes there. The horror of it is compounded by the timing. Dexter is, at the moment Arthur acts, feeling something like triumph. He's closed in on Arthur. He has a plan. He's in the hotel lift thinking about how this all resolves, and Arthur has already resolved it. The phone call home, the silence, the camera cutting away. The show makes you understand what's happened a moment before Dexter does, which is a wrenching piece of storytelling. Rita's murder haunts the rest of the series. It's the clearest possible demonstration that Dexter's double life has costs that land on people who had no idea what they were living next to. She didn't know. She was packing for a honeymoon. And the thing that killed her was the consequence of something she had no knowledge of and no way to protect herself from. Arthur Mitchell never set out to investigate Dexter. He set out to live out his years undiscovered, which had been working for 3 decades. It was Dexter who forced the recognition. And recognition, in Arthur's case, produced not justice, but grief. A different kind of grief than any of the investigators on this list produced, but grief all the same. Of everyone on this list, Deborah's story is the hardest to summarize neatly, because Deb doesn't just suspect Dexter. She finds out everything all at once and then has to figure out what to do with that knowledge for the rest of her life. which, as it turns out, isn't as long as it should have been. The discovery happens at the end of Season 6 and into Season 7, and it's built across 2 different tracks. The first is that Deb, having just had a therapy-induced realization that her feelings for Dexter are more complicated than fraternal, goes to his flat to talk to him. She finds him finishing a kill. Travis Marshall, the doomsday killer, Dexter in his kill clothes, a dead man on a table. The church set on fire behind them. Deb sees all of it. And then, a few episodes into Season 7, she goes back to his flat alone. She finds the kill tools, she finds the blood slide box. She spreads them out on his coffee table and sits with them and waits for him to come home. And when Dexter walks in, she asks him very quietly whether he killed all those people. He says yes. She asks if he's a serial killer. He says yes. The word doesn't do justice to the sequence. Jennifer Carpenter is extraordinary in those scenes. Deb goes through about 6 different kinds of shock in quick succession. There's the initial horror, then the physical reaction. She runs out, she vomits, then this terrible, quiet grief that settles in when she comes back and starts asking the real questions. How long? Did Harry know? Did any of it mean anything? The season that follows is, in a lot of ways, the most interesting stretch of the show, because Deb knows, and she can't unknow it, and she can't report it without destroying her career and her family and her own life, and she can't quite figure out what she feels. She has nightmares. She dreams of Dexter in his kill clothes asking her to be his. She sits in baths that fill with blood. The knowledge has taken up residence in her body as well as her mind. She becomes complicit, gradually and then quite suddenly. She interviews Philip Barnes's family to prevent LaGuerta from doing it. She offers to help plant evidence. She drives past LaGuerta's house to monitor her. These are things Deb Morgan, straight arrow, loudly moral, swears like a sailor but always on the right side, would never have done before. And she knows that. She keeps saying she knows that. The shipping container is where the complicity becomes permanent. LaGuerta has set the trap using Hector Estrada. She's there when Dexter arrives. She has a gun. She is bleeding. She tells Deborah to shoot Dexter. She makes the case that Dexter is a serial killer, that Deb knows it, that there is only one right thing to do here. And she's right, objectively, completely. If you strip away everything else, LaGuerta is right. Deb shoots her instead. I don't think the show ever quite recovers from that moment, to be honest. Not in a storytelling sense. Season 8 is well aware that this is what happened and interrogates it seriously. But in terms of what Deb is after that, she's not the same. She uses alcohol and drugs to stay numb. She takes a private security job partly to have somewhere to put herself outside of a department she can't face. She's in therapy with Dr. Vogel, who knows about Dexter, which is its own strange closed loop. She tries at some point to drive them both into a lake, steers into the water while they're talking. Dexter goes unconscious. Deb swims back and pulls him out because the impulse to save him is more fundamental than the decision she'd made. She tells Vogel afterward that she got it half right, meaning Harry was right that Dexter needed to be managed, but got it wrong that the code would be enough. I've thought about that line a lot. It's a complicated piece of writing for a character who's been pushed well past what she can actually process. Let me talk a bit more about what the show is doing with Deb across Season 7, because I think it's the season's strongest element and also its most uncomfortable one. Deb knowing Dexter's secret changes the texture of every scene she's in. Jennifer Carpenter plays it with this quality of barely managed horror that never quite becomes hysteria. Deb is too practical, too professional, too fundamentally her father's daughter to completely fall apart. Instead, she functions, but with this fault line running through everything. You can see it in the way she holds herself in the squad room. She's looking at colleagues who don't know what she knows. She's speaking in code about things they can't hear. She's simultaneously the most competent lieutenant in the room and the person most in danger of losing everything. Her offer to plant evidence is the moment I always think of as the line she can't uncross. It comes fairly early in season 7, when Dexter is still working out how to respond to Lagerta's renewed investigation. Deb says, flatly, that she'll plant Dokes' DNA at the fake boat storage unit if it will make the case against Dexter go away. She says this because she doesn't want Harrison growing up without a father. She says this as if it's a practical suggestion rather than a moral catastrophe. And the show lets her do it. It doesn't soften this. Deb plants the evidence. Deb makes herself complicit. And the logic of it, love for Dexter, protection of Harrison, preservation of something she's already decided she can't destroy, is coherent. It's comprehensible. That's the thing about the best moments in this show. The terrible choices make sense if you follow the reasoning far enough back. The dreams are worth mentioning too. Deb's nightmares in season 7, where Dexter appears in his kill clothes asking her to be his, are the show externalizing what she can't say in her waking life. She's dreaming about the things she knows and can't unknow, about the way knowledge of someone changes everything about your relationship to them, about the particular horror of discovering that someone you love is a version of themselves you never knew existed. The dreams are obviously symbolic, but they're effective symbolism. They tell you where Deb is in a way that the dialogue, careful and oblique as it is, sometimes can't. By season 8, the equilibrium Deb and Dexter have found is fragile in a specific way. It's not peace, it's more like a ceasefire. Both of them functioning within the understanding that this is how things are now, without either of them being comfortable with it. Deb is trying to live inside the knowledge. Dexter's trying to not give her reasons to regret protecting him. It doesn't fully work for either of them, but it's what they have. There's a dimension to Deb's arc that I think often gets underplayed in favor of the more dramatic moments, which is the grief of it. Not just for what she discovered, but for the version of her life that ended the moment she found out. Deb Morgan had a straightforward moral compass for all her chaos. She was foul-mouthed and impulsive and sometimes self-destructive, but she was honest, and she believed in the work she did, and the work mattered to her because she genuinely thought that catching the people who hurt others was worth doing. That belief had a simplicity to it that the show treated with real affection. Learning the truth didn't just tell Deb something about Dexter, it told her something about her whole life, about the childhood she'd shared with him, about the father who kept her in the dark, about her own career and whether it meant what she thought it meant if her brother, who she'd helped and supported and been proud of and worried about, was doing what he was doing in the dark all along. The knowledge rewrites everything. That's what makes it so difficult to carry. It's not just Dexter she has to recontextualize. It's herself. The moment she shoots, LaGuerta isn't just about protecting Dexter, it's also by that point about protecting herself. Because if Dexter goes down, everything she knows comes out. What she did with the evidence, what she covered, who she's become since the shipping container where she watched Travis Marshall. She's protecting her brother, and she's protecting herself, and she's protecting the story she's been telling herself about why this was all survivable. She shoots Lagerta to keep all of that intact. And then, of course, it isn't intact at all. It never really was. And then Saxon shoots her, and it becomes irreversible in a different way. Deb Morgan, who knew more about Dexter Morgan than anyone else in the world except the people who helped create him, dies having protected his secret to the end. The knowledge that destroyed her peace is the knowledge she took with her. By season 8, Deb and Dexter have reached a fragile, strange equilibrium. She's still helping him. Not enthusiastically, but she's there. She's trying to hold her life together. And then Oliver Saxon, the brain surgeon whose connection to Dr. Vogel is its own extended subplot, shoots her during his arrest. A single bullet. She survives the immediate surgery but has a massive stroke while in recovery. Brain death. She's on a ventilator when Dexter comes to say goodbye. He disconnects her from the machine himself during a hurricane, carries her body out through a hospital that's being evacuated, takes her out on the boat, holds her for a moment, and drops her into the water, and then drives into the storm. Deb Morgan knew more about Dexter than anyone else in the original series. She knew everything eventually. And the knowledge didn't free her or lead to justice or produce any kind of resolution. It just became one more weight she carried until she couldn't carry it anymore. Vogel is a strange case because she arrives in season 8, already knowing everything there is to know. She's not discovering Dexter's secret. She helped build it. The Code of Harry was her idea, developed in consultation with Harry over years of sessions that she kept on DVD. She has been from a distance monitoring what her creation produced, and she seems to feel about it something like pride. The reveal of Vogel's role in Dexter's life is one of the more effective pieces of season 8, which is a season that has some problems, but also does genuinely interesting things with the mythology of the show. The idea that Harry didn't come up with the code alone, that he was operating under the guidance of a neuropsychiatrist who specialized in psychopathy and who saw in young Dexter not a child to be saved, but a subject to be managed, reframes everything we thought we knew about Dexter's origin. Vogel tells Dexter that she convinced Harry his urges couldn't be stopped, that she recognized the markers, that she felt the code was the most workable solution to an otherwise unworkable situation. And she says all of this with this particular brand of clinical warmth. She clearly does care about Dexter in her way, but the caring is wrapped in professional detachment and a slightly uncomfortable sense of authorship. She made him. She's proud of how he turned out. Dexter's response to Vogel is complicated. He doesn't trust her, at least initially. He wonders if she's using him. And she is, a little, because she needs someone to deal with a threat she can't handle herself. A former patient is leaving pieces of brain on her doorstep. She needs the thing she built to do what it was built for. Their relationship across season 8 is genuinely interesting in the quieter way that the later seasons do interesting things. Not with the same propulsive energy as the earlier ones, but with a kind of late series contemplation. Vogel is one of the few characters who can have a completely honest conversation with Dexter because she's known what he is from the beginning and has never needed to be fooled. She's killed by Daniel Vogel, Oliver Saxon, the brain surgeon, who turns out to be her son, a patient she couldn't redirect, whose violence she had tried and failed to channel the way she channeled Dexter's. There's something almost unbearably sad about that. The person who saved Dexter's life by giving his darkness a shape was undone by another attempt at the same project going completely, fatally wrong. She sits across from him at her kitchen table and he cuts her throat. Dexter arrives too late. She's already gone. And the grief he feels is real, possibly one of the more genuine emotional responses he has in the entire series. Because Vogel was someone who saw him completely and still chose to be in his life. Vogel's arc in season 8 also does something interesting with the question of accountability. She helped create this. She designed the framework that Dexter has operated within for his entire adult life. She looked at a damaged child and decided with Harry that the most responsible thing they could do was point the damage toward people who had themselves damaged others. And she has lived for decades with that decision. Not in a tormented way, she's too clinical for that, but she has thought about it. The DVDs are evidence of that. She kept them. She kept every session, every conversation, every moment of Harry's doubt and her reassurance. She was documenting something, archiving it. Whether out of professional habit or something closer to conscience is never quite made clear. The thing about Vogel that I think the show handles well is her lack of obvious guilt. She doesn't apologize for what she did. She doesn't hedge about it. She thinks the code was the right choice, and she stands by it, even at the end, even with the evidence of what it produced spread out around her. That confidence is either admirable or chilling, depending on where you sit with the show's moral universe. And I suspect it's intentionally placed in that uncertain space. She's one of the few characters who knew Dexter completely, processed that knowledge, and stayed. Not out of compulsion or fear like Lila, not out of love and its complications like Deb, but out of something closer to intellectual commitment, She believed in what she made, and she wanted to stay close to it. There's a version of Vogel that is the show's most honest portrait of complicity. The person who made a choice they can defend, and who never stopped defending it, and who died because someone else she couldn't save came back to collect what they felt they were owed. And now we get to New Blood and to Angela Bishop, who is in many ways the most impressive investigator on this entire list. Because she figures it out from thousands of miles away, years after the fact, working a completely independent angle without any of the personal connection or instinctive recognition that helped people like Dokes and Lagerta get close. Angela just does the work, carefully, methodically, with the specific quality of a small-town chief of police who has always had too much time to think about things. The investigation starts with Matt Caldwell. Dexter kills Matt in episode 1 of New Blood. He's a reckless, arrogant man who accidentally shot a member of the Seneca Nation on a hunting trip. And Dexter, who has been resisting his dark passenger for 10 years of careful Iron Lake living, breaks. He kills Matt and disposes of the body in an old iron mine. Angela's suspicion of Jim Lindsay, which is what Dexter is calling himself in Iron Lake, starts with small things. He was near the area where Matt went missing. His alibi has a quality to it that doesn't quite sit right. A thermal camera catches footage of someone in the woods at the relevant time that could match him. She can't prove anything. She isn't even sure she suspects anything specific. But she keeps the thread. What turns suspicion into investigation is the forensics. A crime scene investigator from Albany processes the area and finds human blood mixed with deer blood at the scene, evidence of an attack that was cleaned up. Then Matt's body is eventually recovered, and the remains include bone screws, surgical hardware, metal pins from an orthopedic procedure. Specific, identifiable hardware that doesn't match Matt Caldwell's medical records. Angela calls in favors, follows evidence, and eventually lands on something that connects Iron Lake's cases to a much older pattern. The method of disposal, the precision, the lack of evidence, the specific way the victims were killed, reminds her of something. She pulls Bay Harbor butcher files. She looks at injection marks on victims. She starts asking about ketamine. A local witness named Miles O'Flynn had told her that someone poked him in the neck with a needle. An autopsy on another local victim, Jasper Hodge, shows an injection mark and ketamine in his system. Angela looks at Bay Harbor butcher case files and finds injection marks and the same drug in those victims. She connects Iron Lake to Miami. She connects Jim Lindsay to Dexter Morgan. And then she calls Angel Batista. That phone call is one of the best scenes in New Blood. Angela tells Batista that Dexter Morgan isn't dead, that she has him in custody, that she has cases in Iron Lake that match Bay Harbor butcher patterns. And Batista, who has spent years trying to move past all of it, who last saw Dexter at Deb's funeral essentially, goes quiet for a moment and then says he'll come up with everything he has. He also mentions carefully that Maria Lagerta was murdered right after she revealed her suspicions about Dexter. Angela hears that. She understands what it means. The interrogation scenes at the Iron Lake police station are methodical and well-written. Angela lays out her evidence piece by piece. Dexter alternates between deflection and counter-accusation, pointing at Kurt Caldwell, who is also a serial killer and who has genuinely been framing Dexter for some of his crimes. And Angela listens to all of it without committing to any of it. She's not fooled. She's not unsympathetic. She's just doing her job. She arrests Dexter for Matt Caldwell's murder while continuing to build the larger case. She turns off the camera during one interrogation so he can tell her about Kurt's victims without it going on record. She goes to Kurt's cabin and finds the bunker and what's inside, and that gives her what she needs to prosecute Kurt separately from Dexter. The series ends before Angela's full case against Dexter can be pursued because Harrison shoots Dexter first. But Angela had him. She had the evidence, she had the methodology, she had the connection to Miami, and she had Batista on the way up. In the entire franchise, she is the investigator who came closest to a legitimate, evidence-based prosecution. She did it without knowing Dexter personally, without any of the instinctive recognition that Dokes had, without years of proximity, like LaGuerta. She just looked at the cases and followed where they led. There's something I find particularly satisfying about the ketamine thread as a piece of detective work. It's such a specific detail, not a broad pattern, not just similar disposal method or victim profile matches, but a specific drug, a specific injection site, a specific combination that appears in two context years and geography apart. Angela, working a small town in upstate New York, connects what she's seeing locally to a federal case that was officially closed years ago because she was paying close enough attention to the chemistry. That's genuinely good police work. That's not luck or instinct. That's someone doing the reading. The bone screws are another strong element of her investigation. They come from Matt's remains in the iron mine, and they don't match Matt's medical records. This tells Angela two things: that someone else was in the mine, and that whoever put Matt there wanted the body hidden but couldn't fully remove evidence of a previous disposal. It's a mistake on Dexter's part, a small one, the kind that accumulates, and Angela catches it. What strikes me about Angela's arc in New Blood is how different Iron Lake is from Miami as an investigative environment. Miami Metro is a large department with heavy caseloads and institutional politics, and a high rate of cases going unsolved because there are simply too many of them. Angela runs a police department in a town of under 3,000 people. She has time. She has the kind of attention that comes from knowing everyone and caring what happens to them. When someone goes missing in Iron Lake, she looks until she finds something. That quality, sustained, unhurried attention, is exactly what Dexter's operations in Miami were structured to avoid. He built his double life for a city. He was not prepared for a small town with a thoughtful chief of police who had no pressing reason to stop looking. The scene where Angela calls Batista deserves a longer look than it usually gets in discussions of New Blood. She's lying on the bonnet of her car looking at the sky, and she suddenly says, "Motherfucker," which is the New Blood equivalent of a Deb Morgan moment genuinely, and goes inside to make the call. The sequence of what she's worked out is clear. Dexter Morgan is in Iron Lake. Dexter Morgan was suspected of being the Bay Harbor butcher. Maria Laguerta was murdered shortly after making that connection. Angela is quick enough to understand that calling Batista puts her in potential danger. She makes the call anyway. Batista's response, the long pause, the disbelief, the professional settling into what this means, is well played by David Zayas. He's been carrying this for years. He was at Laguerta's funeral. He promoted the woman who shot her. He's looked at Dexter Morgan across departmental tables and shaken his hand and sat next to him at Deb's memorial service. And now someone is telling him Dexter is alive, and it's not over, and there are new cases. Batista says he'll come with everything he has. That conversation is the show finally connecting the dots in a way that's been waiting to happen since season 7. Angela's independent investigation reaching backward into Miami's history, Batista's institutional memory completing the picture. Together they have something that neither would have alone: the local evidence that puts Dexter in Iron Lake, and the historical context that explains what Dexter is. Angela gets one more thing right in the end that most of the other investigators on this list don't. She finds Kurt Caldwell's victims. She acts on Dexter's information about the bunker. She builds the case that Iron Lake needed building. She doesn't let the existence of a larger case distract from the local harm that's been done. That discipline, doing the job that's in front of you even when a bigger story is unfolding, is characteristic of everything we've seen from her. She had him. She really did. And in the franchise's ongoing life, Resurrection is currently airing as of this recording. The question of what Angela's investigation produces officially, whether Batista's involvement creates institutional momentum, whether Iron Lake's cases get properly closed, is still in motion. The conversation between that small-town investigation and Miami's history isn't finished, which makes Angela's arc, uniquely among the people on this list, still open. Everyone else either failed or died or chose to stop looking. Angela is still looking, and Batista, who has been carrying what he knows for years, is on his way to help. I find that genuinely interesting as a place for the franchise to be. After everything, after Dokes and LaGuardia and all of it, the investigation that finally produced something real was started by a police chief in a town of under 3,000 people. who connected ketamine and bone screws to a cold case from Miami by staying with it long enough for the pattern to become visible. Patient, methodical, small-town attention, winning out where 2 decades of professional law enforcement in a major city couldn't. There's something almost poetic about that. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it feels right. Harrison is the last entry on this list, and he's different from all the others in a way that I find genuinely moving. Everyone else who suspected or discovered Dexter's secret came to it from the outside. Harrison came to it from inside. From being raised by a man who had faked his own death and then been surprised by his son showing up on his doorstep, and who spent the whole of New Blood trying to figure out how much of himself to show his kid. Harrison had a complicated relationship with violence from early on. He was born in a pool of blood. His mother's blood on the bathroom floor of their house, placed there by the Trinity killer in the last act of his long killing career. He doesn't consciously remember it, but the show suggests, through a series of quiet moments, that something of it stayed with him. He's drawn to physical conflict. He's good at wrestling in a way that has an edge to it. He doesn't back down from situations that most teenagers would walk away from. When he tracks Dexter down to Iron Lake, having found him through a bowling Instagram post, which is one of the more human details in the whole franchise, he isn't coming with suspicion exactly, he's coming with questions about who his father is, about why he faked his death and stayed away, about what kind of person does that to their child. The suspicion builds slowly across New Blood. Harrison watches Dexter in the woods, stalking the white deer in the opening sequence. The one Dexter can't bring himself to shoot because he's been suppressing his dark passenger for a decade. Harrison sees his father move through that situation with a particular quality of focused patience that a kid who wrestles and pays attention would notice. He starts cataloging other moments. The night absences, the reaction to violence that doesn't quite match a normal person's reaction to violence. And then there's the actual conversation. Dexter tells Harrison the truth. Not all of it, not immediately, but enough. He explains the dark passenger, he explains the code, he explains, or tries to, why he does what he does. And Harrison listens and thinks, and eventually tells his father that he thinks he might have the same thing. The same pull toward darkness, the same complicated relationship with violence. Dexter's response to this is to try to teach Harrison what he was taught, to give him the code, to give him the same framework that Harry gave Dexter, and hope that it holds. It doesn't get the chance to be tested properly. Harrison sees enough. He sees what his father is fully by the end. And he makes the decision that Dexter once made with his own brother, that the most loving thing available is also the most permanent. He shoots Dexter with the rifle. He's crying while he does it. Dexter tells him it's okay, that Harrison did the right thing. It's a genuinely devastating sequence, and I think it's the right ending for Dexter's arc, even if it's not the ending most people expected. Because the whole show, in some sense, is about whether what Harry built was viable, whether the code holds, whether the darkness can be given a shape that doesn't eventually consume everyone around it. Harrison is the answer. He grew up in the shadow of all of it, without knowing he was for most of his life. And when he finally saw the full picture, he decided the cycle ended here. There's something worth noting about how Harrison's discovery of the truth differs from every other discovery on this list. Lagerda found a blood slide and built a case. Angela found bone screws and followed a chemical trace. Deb found kill tools spread out on a coffee table. All of them discovered the truth through evidence, through things that could be pointed at and named and filed. Harrison discovers the truth differently. He discovers it through his father, through the conversations Dexter initiates, partly because Dexter is uncertain how to raise a son who shows the same tendencies, partly because he's tired of performing normalcy for the one person he most wants to be honest with. Dexter tells Harrison about the dark passenger not as a confession, but as a context. He's trying to explain something about both of them. And Harrison, who has spent enough time in the world to have developed his own relationship to the violence inside him, listens. The moment where Harrison tells Dexter he thinks he might have the same thing, the same pull, the same darkness, is one of the more affecting scenes in New Blood, partly because of how Dexter receives it. He doesn't run from it, he doesn't deny it, he recognizes it, and his first instinct is to do what Harry did. Give it a structure, channel it, make it survivable. But Harrison has been watching. He's been watching how the structure sits on Dexter, whether the code actually holds or whether it's a rationalization that permits things it shouldn't. He sees Dexter kill Kurt Caldwell, which is code compliant. He sees other things that are less clean. He watches the man who abandoned him for a decade try to become a father. And he watches the effort and the genuine care. And he also watches the thing underneath both of them that has no name but that he recognizes from the inside. And at the end, Harrison makes the same assessment that Harry once made about Dexter, that the damage is real, that the urges don't go away, that someone has to decide what happens next. He makes a different conclusion than Harry did. Harry decided to contain and redirect. Harrison decides to end. There's no satisfaction in it, and the show doesn't ask you to feel any. Just the quiet horror of a young man with tear tracks on his face, holding a rifle, and a father on the snow telling him that he did the right thing. Two people who could see each other completely, one of them choosing to stop the other rather than live in the shadow of what they both knew was there. It's the most complete version of the suspicion story in a way, because Harrison didn't just suspect, he understood. And understanding, for him, produced the outcome that none of the investigators managed, not through evidence or institutional process or professional obligation, but through the particular clarity of a son who finally saw his father. So, that's the list. Harry, who knew first and bore the weight of it longest. Dokes, who was right from day one and paid for it. Lundy, who built the best profile and never got to finish the job. Lila, who knew and chose to be complicit. Brian, who knew because he was the same thing. LaGuerta, who spent years being right and died for it. Quinn, who got close and chose not to get any closer. Liddy, who got too close with too little backup. Isaac, who followed the thread from Ukraine to a flat in Miami and ran out of time. Arthur, who recognized a fellow predator and responded by going after his family. Deb, who knew everything and carried it until she couldn't. Vogel, who built the thing and watched it run. Angela, who assembled the case piece by piece from a small town in upstate New York. And Harrison, who finally gently ended it. What strikes me sitting with all of that is how rarely any of them were working from the same information. They each had a different angle, a different piece of the picture. Dokes had instinct and recognition. LaGuerta had the blood slide and years of loyalty to a dead colleague. Angela had ketamine and bone screws and a late-night epiphany on the bonnet of her car. None of them compared notes. None of them knew what the others knew. If Dokes and LaGuerta had had a proper conversation, if Lundy had lived long enough to hear Angela's theory, the show would have been considerably shorter, which is interesting in itself, because Dexter's survival isn't really about how clever he is, though he is clever. It's about the way that information stays siloed. People don't talk to each other as much as they should. Institutions protect their conclusions even when those conclusions are wrong. The man with the blood slides in his air conditioning unit keeps bringing donuts and smiling, and the people around him are too busy doing their own jobs to step back and look at the whole picture. There's something very true to life about that, I think. Not about serial killers specifically, but about how much depends on people being willing to say the uncomfortable thing. To follow the instinct that doesn't fit the official version. LaGuerta did that, Dokes did that, Angela did that. And the show, to its credit, treats all three of them with real respect, even when the institutional machinery is grinding against them, even when everyone around them is telling them to let it go. There's also something worth acknowledging about the cost of being on this list. Almost nobody comes through it undamaged. Dokes dies, LaGuerta dies, Lundy dies, Lila dies. Rita dies, not because she suspected anything, but because Arthur Mitchell did and chose to weaponize it. Deb survives until she doesn't. The people who came closest to the truth paid the highest prices, which is either a comment on how dangerous truth-telling is, or a comment on how good Dexter is at protecting his secret, or probably both simultaneously. The ones who survived, Quinn, Batista, Angela, are the ones who either stopped looking, didn't start looking, or arrived too late for the full consequence. There's something uncomfortable about that distribution. The people with the strongest investigative instincts and the most moral conviction tended to end up in the worst positions. And yet, the show doesn't let that be nihilistic. It doesn't say, and therefore looking is pointless. What it says, I think, is more complicated and more honest. It says, looking costs something. Sometimes it costs everything. And some people choose to pay that cost anyway, because not looking costs something too, even if the bill arrives differently. La Guerta paid with her life. Quinn paid with his integrity. Angela paid with years of sleep, probably, though she's still standing. Each of them made their calculation. The show respects all of it. That's what Dexter is in the end, for all its pulpy pleasures and narrative conveniences. A show about what it costs to see clearly, about the gap between what we know and what we're willing to do with what we know. About the people who keep looking even when it would be easier to stop. You don't rewatch Dexter season after season because you want to see someone get away with it. You rewatch it because the people trying to catch him are interesting. Because the show knows that the most compelling thing about a secret is the quality of attention it draws. Every person on this list looked at Dexter Morgan and saw something that everyone else missed. That's worth something, even when it doesn't change the outcome. And there will be more to talk about. I've got pieces planned on the original Sin prequel, which fills in some of the Harry and Dexter backstory in ways that add texture to some of what we've talked about tonight. There's Resurrection, which picks up after New Blood and apparently has some things to say about consequences, though I'll save my thoughts on that for another evening. And there's always more to find in the original run, moments that reward a closer look, things that land differently after you've been through the whole series once or twice or 6 times. But for now, wherever you are tonight, I hope this was a comfortable couple of hours. The Miami nights are warm and the ocean is out there, and the dark passenger is someone else's problem. Sleep well.